All right, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to the 2014 IMS Annual Conference, Reacting to Refugee Crisis in the Middle East, responses from states, scholars, and humanitarian organizations. My name is Mark Lynch. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies and the Project on Middle East Political Science. And I'm just really excited to be able to have this discussion and this extraordinary group of scholars and practitioners here to discuss what is one of the most important issues facing the Middle East. Obviously not a new issue, and one of the ways we've tried to design this conference is to bring historical perspective to bear and comparative perspective to bear on the current set of challenges facing refugees and displaced populations in the Middle East. Obviously, at least obviously to me, the motivating driving force behind holding this conference now is Syria and the frankly almost unbelievable level of refugee crisis and displacement facing the Syrian people. But I've been working on and around refugee issues, Iraqi refugee issues, for the last decade, and the problems are not new. Many of the speakers on this conference and looking around the room, people here in the audience have been working with Palestinian refugees, with a wide range of refugees in the Middle East over a long period. So I'm extremely excited to be able to listen and hear and learn from the scholars who are assembled here today. We have the conference program divided into three general panels. Julie Peteet, who I'll introduce in a moment, will be giving some opening framing remarks, and then we'll go directly into the first panel of state responses to refugee flows, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, and Julie will be part of Professor Peteet will be part of of that discussion, and we'll move directly into that. Before we get started, I would like to really sincerely thank the Department of Education. Their Title VI grant is what makes this conference possible. For those of you who don't know, the Title VI program has been facing severe challenges in Congress in the budget appropriations process, and one of the charges that is often made against it is that it doesn't contribute to the national interest or to addressing real issues of urgent global demand and need, and I don't see how anybody could look at this conference and conclude that this is not making a major contribution to one of the world's most urgent and pressing problems. I'd also like to thank the Middle East Policy Forum and Ambassador Skip Ghanim for their support, and I'd like to thank myself through the Project on Middle East Political Science and Shana Marshall for organizing the entire conference. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Julie Peteet to make some opening remarks. Professor Peteet is a professor of anthropology at the University of Louisville. Anybody who has worked on or thought about issues related to displacement and refugees or the Palestinian issue will be deeply familiar with her writing and with her output. She's written several books, Gender in Crisis, Women in the Palestinian Resistance Movement, and Landscape of Hope and Despair, Palestinian Refugee Camps, and she's currently working on a project, says it's a forthcoming project, Space and Mobility in Palestine. She's one of the leading anthropologists and thinkers on the issues facing the Palestinian people and has been grappling with issues of displacement and refugees for a long and productive career. I'm really delighted to welcome Julie Peteet here to open our conference. Thank you, Julie.
I'm just going to close this. Well, actually, I can work on top of it. It works. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's fine. I don't want to take down your nice poster there. Okay. Well, thank you. It's nice to see you all here and to see people interested in this topic. So I'm going to make some framing comments for this morning to kind of lead off discussion, hopefully. And, I'll start with the historical perspective. The last century opened and closed with mass refugee movements, from the Armenians to the Bosnians and the Rwandans, and it was a century punctuated by mass displacement in Europe, in Palestine, and in India, Pakistan, just to mention a few. And of course, our new century opened with mass refugee movements, the Iraqis and now the Syrians, and Palestinian displacement continues apace, though at a slightly slower pace than what we're seeing with Iraqis and Syrians. But it's the sheer magnitude of these events and the human crisis that's unfolding in the region that sometimes they're so stupendous, so overwhelming that I feel we're at a loss for a vocabulary. We're at a loss for a framework sometimes to understand this crisis. I mean, when we say Syria has 2.5 million refugees and 6.5 million IDPs, given the size of their population, this is just stupendous numbers. And any numbers I use today are probably out of date because I compiled them 2 weeks ago. And the numbers continue to climb each day. Now, we can also get lost in the numbers and sometimes lose sight of the emotional landscape of displacement. 2 weeks ago, I was in Zaatari camp, which is home to about 100,000 people. It's probably the second largest refugee camp in the world. And I went to the receiving center, which is the place where Syrians come in. They've just come across the border. They've been registered, and they are in great need and great physical distress. And they come into this sort of warehouse-like setting. And this very tall, very elegant Syrian woman from the, with clothing from, obviously from the Haran area, approached me and very, very politely said, "Can you help me? I'm all alone." And she, she must have been in her 50s. She said, "My son was detained at the border because he lost his documents. And if you don't have documents, you are held up at the border." And she said, "I have nobody." And she said, "It took us 10 days to get here. Refugees are being pushed farther and farther into the eastern desert area to come across." And she said, "It took us 10 days to get here, and all of our money and anything we had was taken by smugglers and bandits." Put those kind of two together. So people are facing increasing risks as they come across that border, and they're coming across, I think, in greater physical distress. And being in that reception area was just this feeling of overwhelming hopelessness, because there were just hundreds and hundreds of people, lots of women, sick children, elderly people, sort of looking dazed, and of course, very tired, very kind of disheveled and hungry. And they're given a mattress and a blanket and a box of emergency food, which has some high-protein biscuits and things in it to get them through the next couple of days. But, speaking to this woman, you start asking, what are we doing as researchers? What is our agenda? What are the questions we ask? And these are questions, I think, that are fundamental to research in crisis situations of any sort. You at one point look around and say, what can I do? And why am I here asking these seemingly silly questions, nosy questions that anthropologists in particular ask? And so what are the questions and why do they matter? And I remember in the Civil War in Lebanon, Jonathan Dibbleby was a very well-known photojournalist. And he had photographed the massacre at Karantina, one of the defining massacres of the Lebanese Civil War. And afterwards, he uttered this statement that has become somewhat iconic. And he said, "Do you take a picture of a dying man, or do you try and save him?" And this is the dilemma that the war correspondent faces, and those of us who work in crises. Okay, what is your task? Okay, and it leads to questions about the ethics of research, as well as what I like to call the "so what" moment, where you ask certain questions or you have certain research agendas, and you have to ask yourself, so what? Why is this important? And to keep that in the back of your mind. Now, as Syria and Iraq unravel and the humanitarian catastrophe continues to overwhelm and the assault on human dignity proceeds apace, we need to search for a vocabulary to grasp and convey the magnitude of human suffering, and to try to understand the new forms of governance that are also being played out by humanitarian aid regimes and host states. Do we have the conceptual tools and analytical frameworks to make sense of this crisis? The standard frameworks we've used in what I will loosely call refugee studies. And this is a field of studies that's both, of course, very theoretical. It's also ethnographic and empirical, which often gets lost in the theory. And it's an applied field as well. Okay? It asks questions that make us think about what is engaged research, and what are the responsibilities of research, and what is your role as an advocate when you do research in a crisis situation. So the field of refugee studies, it continues to develop and mature, and every new refugee crisis leads to new forms of intervention and new kinds of state responses, and thus a continuously developing framework of analysis. Now, every refugee crisis, I think, is a laboratory in a certain sense, in terms of how do you spatially organize refugees, how do you manage and govern them, what are state responses to this mass demographic transformation, and how is aid delivered. Okay? Now, Zaatari camp in Jordan, this large camp, is acknowledged to be a pilot program. People that work there will tell you, oh, this is a pilot program. So you get the sense when you're there that everything's kind of an experiment and we're going to see how it all works. But then isn't every refugee crisis? Because that's the nature of a crisis. Your frameworks that you respond with don't always work so well. And anything I say here today is not meant as a critique of the UNHCR or Jordan's response or that of any of the NGOs. You know, the critiques are well and good and we have to make them, but also acknowledge the tremendous tasks that these organizations are facing. And here I'm just talking about Jordan, where anywhere between 500 and 700 people cross the border every day in a very distressed situation, okay? And it's just overwhelming, you know, the human magnitude of this. But when I say Zaatari has elements of a pilot project, for example, you see maybe the end of rations, okay? And the move towards cash assistance and vouchers, which gets into the biometrics. You know, will rations be a thing of the past in the delivery of refugee aid? We see the big supermarkets, what they call private-public partnership. You know, there's a whole new vocabulary about aid. And we see attempts to impose certain kinds of governance on the camp. So having said that about every refugee crisis as a laboratory of experiment, if you will, move on and just mention a couple of the challenges here to doing research. How do you conduct research in a highly controlled area where access is limited? Zaatari is not just an open camp. It is a militarized camp, highly securitized. And, you know, I did this kind of spatial mapping of the camp and who's where, and line of visibility, who can see who. And it is absolutely chopped up so that refugees don't see the administrators don't see the refugees. Everything is cut off by gates and passageways and chicken wire and barbed wire and even black mesh lining some of these walls so that refugees can't see into base camp, which is where the administration is headquartered. And they can't always see out. Okay, so line of visibility is something to look at. But in any case, it's just questions where access is limited. Because when you're working with refugees, you have to establish some kind of trust. Okay, and how do you do that when access is so tightly controlled? And how do you make your contacts? And I mean, the only way around this is, of course, to recognize the problem and to sort of be, you know, self-reflexive, as the anthropologists would say, about your level of access and who you're talking to and why. A second concern or challenge, particularly with Syrian refugees, is what I'll call the absence of baseline data. And we talked a little bit about this at dinner last night. People are making assessments of what's going on among Syrian refugees without knowing a lot about what went on before they came. And the example I use is the rumors, the story that's been framed about early marriage, that refugees are marrying their daughters at very early ages, 15 and 16. Well, we don't know what age they were married at. What was the average age of marriage in those rural areas? And when you make those assumptions, you're also assuming a kind of homogeneity in Syria between urban and rural areas that might not play out in reality. So baseline data also about politics, I think, is very important. There's assumptions about what is leadership. A third challenge, I think, is the whole production of knowledge by journalists and what have always been with us, and I guess always will, and that's the instant expert, the person who comes for 10 days a week and is going to write the the policy manual or the brief on Jordan. And again, it's not a critique of them, it's in the nature of what they do. But one has to be careful about the way stories are crafted and then become circulated and take on a certain kind of reality in representations of the camps. Zaatari has had 6,000 visitors. And that alone should tell you something about the stories that are being written about the camp and the kind of production of knowledge. What I call, these are short-term knowledge collectors, okay? So that's one thing. And the last sort of major challenge, there are many more, has to do with those things that we don't talk about, the silences in the refugee crisis. We don't talk much about the Iraqis who are in Syria. Where are they? The Palestinians in Syria that are being turned back at the border. We're not talking a lot about refoulement and this kind of tension that sometimes exists between the mandates of UNHCR and UNRWA. Okay, so there are a lot of silences going on. Okay, now, in the rest of my time, I'm just going to throw out a few ideas for research and frameworks. And the first thing I keep thinking about in this refugee crisis is think regionally. Okay? The larger region, I think, should be the point of departure in looking at this refugee crisis. If you think regionally and historically, the region is being remapped. Demographics are just changing so rapidly and with such violence. As states dissolve, we have mass population movements, not just out of states, but into states also. And we continue to have the slow motion ethnic cleansing in Palestine, that slow, steady pace that's sometimes hard to count and discern. Receiving states such as Syria, Lebanon, a quarter of its population now are Syrian refugees. Okay, just try to imagine the U.S. having a quarter of its population received across the border and the kind of hysteria this could generate. So that is, think regionally and what's going on in terms of region and historical demography. Second is what I'll call, we should keep in mind the layering of refugees. Syria is only the latest, and it becomes foremost in everybody's mind, okay? And we all tend to get into this mode, and we forget, well, there's the Iraqis right underneath the Syrians. There's always the Palestinians. There's always the Sudanese also, and many others still, displaced Iranians, people displaced from the Horn of Africa who are in the Middle East. But the latest tends to take prominence. It gets our attention, okay? And there are many other people who are, stranded in space, basically, as refugees, okay, awaiting resettlement. And of course, Amman is the perfect city for looking at the layering of refugees because historically it's a city built by and large by refugees or displaced people. So just to keep in mind the layering and the way we tend to ignore those who came before. Now, I want to talk about urban refugees and camps and kind of segue from one into the other. And, camps get our attention because they're visual. You can see them. They're spatially demarcated. They're on the refugee tourism itinerary, okay? But most of these refugees are in urban areas in Jordan, and certainly in Lebanon, where there are, as far as we know, no official camps. In Jordan, 80% of the refugees, the Syrian refugees, are outside of camps, but we all know about Zaatari, okay? But we don't know a whole lot about the impact of the refugees, say, on Irbid, okay, or Amman. And the refugees, Syrians in Jordan, have moved all over the country. You can be driving through the Jordan Valley and you look to the side and there's a little UNHCR tent, okay, with a couple families, maybe 2 tents. People take their tents and leave the camp if they can, and they go and set up household in agricultural areas where they're providing very cheap labor that Jordanians, one of the first things I'll tell you about the Syrians is, they work really hard. meaning they're very exploitable and that they work for less. Now, urban refugees, of course, it's much harder to find them spatially and to start looking at the networks that they use to build lives in the cities. But certainly Irbid has been overwhelmed by an influx of refugees. And even if you think of, again, regionally and displacement and urbanization, look at Ramallah. You know, Ramallah used to be this sleepy little village that is now this burgeoning urban center. Why? Because people are being pushed out of rural areas into a few well-defined urban areas. But looking at that lets us sort of segue into the question of the camp. And I think the question of the camp, what it is, what is its future, is one that should guide us in our research. Why are there camps for Syrians and there weren't camps for Iraqis? And we need to look also at refugee policy for the past 20 years to understand why we didn't have Iraqi camps and why we have Syrian camps. Look both at U.S. and foreign policy, but also UNHCR and how it was conceptualizing refugees. Because, you know, the past 2 decades, we've seen the figures reverse between IDPs and refugees. And I think there was an idea that we weren't going to see so many refugees. We were going to have containment and just have a lot of IDPs. And, of course, Syria is producing massive numbers of IDPs, again, which there's quite a bit of silence about. But again, thinking about urban and the camp. Now, in Zatari camp, one of the UNHCR hosts told me, we're going to make this camp a city. I said, oh, okay. And I said, what does that mean? And it means we're going to integrate it into the local environment. Well, does that mean, what does local integration mean? Does it mean citizenship? No. Doesn't mean citizenship. Does it mean permanent settlement? No. It means local integration, development. And again, these are these new buzzwords, along with privatization, entrepreneurs, public-private partnership, and development. It's kind of a new discourse that I think we still have to plow through. And Zatari is, in many ways, like a city, but it's also not like a city in many ways. It is a camp. But I think the idea of the camp is being rethought in its temporal dimensions. And this is where, you know, fieldwork with UNHCR would be wonderful if someone can do that. You know, ideally, we used to think of camps as having 3 stages in their life: the emergency phase, the maintenance phase, and closure. Okay, such as the camps in Southeast Asia or Central America, that was the model. Now the plan is to bypass maintenance, and I think some of that is related to the coded fear of Palestinianization, that you cannot let camps just stay in the maintenance phase. And yet, of course, there's the tension with Jordan, who the last thing Jordan wants is another, million new citizens or permanent residents or whatever they're going to be. But in any case, it's just to start thinking about this kind of discourse. And in spite of the idea that this camp is supposed to become a city, it's very much a space of segregation, confinement, securitization, militarization. Okay. Now, having said that, camps are also places where people make homes. They leave an imprint on space. This is something that, you know, I wrote about for Palestinians. You know, what kind of spaces are these? They're spaces of waiting for return. They're spaces of being stranded. But there are also places where people make new homes. Okay? And this is the contradiction of the camp that has been captured. Agier talks about, these are temporary cities. The paradox of the camp is, it's indefinite temporality, but it's a space that is transformed because its occupants make it home. And you can see when you go into Zatari immediately how the refugees make this place home. The aid regime has it divided into districts, and they look very neat the way they're supposed to be. And then what the refugees do, you give them their tent or their caravan, and they move out of their assigned district. They move to where they have family or extended family or fellow villagers, and they make these really interesting conglomerations of tents and caravans they've been given caravans. And I think the idea of caravans are kind of cool because it's better than a tent, but for the local people, the Jordanians, it's not a house. Caravan is mobile. You can pick it up and move it, okay? So rather than building cinder block houses, the caravan kind of resolves some issues. But in any case, you see refugee dignity very much at work. And this, what I felt in Zaatari camp was this buzzing of activity, of people building and working and making their environment in these piecing together tents and caravans and porches and putting a little plant out there. And of course, great, as I'll use the term, entrepreneurial activity as people open shops. So in any case, and this is called, people say this is privatization, that the refugees privatize their environment. And I mean, I would call it making place, but there is this new discourse that you kind of pick up on about privatization that some people would love. It's just a very kind of odd use of the term here. Now, and I'll just say a few words about governance and political leadership, because this is a big unknown, unless you're living in these camps and you really know these the situation well, and you know, and as an anthropologist, I have to say you've got to understand kinship and regional ties as well. And something that we forget in this region of northern Jordan, southern Syria, historically, the ties between this region are very, very strong in terms of identity, especially among older generation, and in terms of trade, and of course smuggling, it's a border, in terms of marriage, education. For a long time in that area of northern Jordan, higher education, you went to Damascus. You didn't go to that cow town, Amman, which, for the older generation, that's how it was kind of conceptualized. So there are deep historical ties between these two regions that are being activated, okay, as refugees come across this border. And this border is only, the border's only 15 kilometers from the camp, which is kind of a no-no in refugee work. It's supposed to be at least 50 kilometers. But in any case, I got a sense in this camp there's kind of a struggle over leadership. UNHCR and the NGOs would like to see evolve what they call traditional leadership. Yes, what's traditional leadership? Well, it's the old village leaders. Well, that's fine and good, and they're supposed to be set up against the new street leaders, the Abus. And this is something the journalists pick up and one has to be very careful about because it becomes the story, okay, of a few street leaders. But, in camps, of course, leadership arises in these new settlements. And not just with, the rebels who supposedly were running these camps in the beginning. But in any case, there's this attempt to resurrect traditional leaders and put them in charge. Well, what's a traditional leader? What kind of power did he have before he got here? Okay, it could be like the tribal sheikhs in Iraq, who really, were not that empowered until the U.S. came in and made them so. Okay, so we have to be careful about the assumptions about political power in this area. And there's just so much we don't know. Okay. Now, I'm going to just say, moving quickly here, another area to look at is the question of biometrics and the delivery of aid, because this is really something new. It's not the first time biometrics have been used for refugees. They were used a little bit about 5 years ago in parts of Africa and in Pakistan. But now, as Syrians come across the border, they do the retinal scan, and that's on their ID card. And then cash assistance now is done again with the retinal scan. And you go to the ATM machine to get your cash assistance. This is the private-public partnership with the Cairo Amman Bank. And all you have to do is use the retinal scan. And this is to put a lid on the proverbial cheating refugee, okay? A concept that goes way back in refugee studies, that refugees by nature cheat, okay? That they're always trying to get something that they're not really due for. They double register, so they get double rations, or they don't report deaths, they over-report births, these kinds of things, or they sell rations, or give them to other people, what have you, the idea of the cheating refugee. So biometrics are both, they are couched in the discourse of this is efficiency and it helps us deliver better aid and not have waste through fraud, which is well and good, but it's also a security measure. And, you know, we do have to ask ultimately, who owns your biometric data, okay? And what happens to it if a refugee crisis is over? Where is this biometric data on you, okay? And supposedly people have, you know, at first they were hesitant, people coming from kind of authoritarian states where information can be life and death, don't always like to give those kinds of information, you know, the scan and the fingerprint. But they've done it because that's how you get your cash assistance. And as I was told, well, it's critical mass. You know, if a few do it, then they all do it. But in any case, it's just, I think research on biometrics and people's attitudes towards biometrics and the legal issues are of, you know, research concern to be a good research topic. Now, and, you know, when I said rations, I think we have de-rationing. People now go to, they have vouchers instead of the distribution of rations. You know, and if you worked in Palestinian camps, you always saw, you know, ration day was this big day in the camp, and everybody go and get their rations. And it was chaotic, and the warehouse and the distribution center are always considered the most dangerous areas in a camp. That's why they're often put on the periphery, okay, because you can have riots over rations. But now you have Safeway in the camp, and another one, I forget the name, one of these big gleaming supermarkets, and you take your vouchers. And it is nice because you can buy what you need, what your particular family needs, rather than being given a certain kind of ration. Okay, now I'm just going to start to wrap this up, mentioning some ideas on discourse about refugees in Jordan. You know, what is the local discourse on refugees, and what does the population call them, and how does it articulate or not, or diverge from that of the host country? And having been in Jordan off and on for many, many years, I feel the animosity towards Syrians is much less than it was towards Iraqis. I don't know why. I think perhaps the Iraqis coincided with the first economic shocks that came, and Syrians are seen as not so much contributing to economic decline. They're much poorer also. They're not bringing in as much capital, that people say, as the Iraqis did. And people always tell me, well, they're such hard workers, and they're entrepreneurial, and they cook well. So there's this idea of we're getting all this Syrian food because these guys are working in the restaurants. And they're doing catering. And, you know, I've been in homes where someone said, where'd you get the food? And they say, well, I got a Syrian to do it. You did? You got a Syrian? Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you get a Jordanian? And they say, well, look at the difference in the food. So in any case, just to inject a little humor in this, but, you know, the Jordanian government often uses still that term guests. These are our guests, which sounds so wonderful, you know, in terms of Arab culture, the whole notion of hospitality. But you have to be careful, you know, not to have culture replacing international law, you know, or trumping international law. And the guest also leaves eventually in, you know, the sort of tradition of hosting. And the guest is obliged to behave in certain ways. So the guest metaphor has its own restrictions as well. Now, and local areas, especially around Zaatari, are being overwhelmed by refugees. Zaatari village is, you know, being swallowed up. It was a village of maybe 3,000 people, now has a camp right on its edge of 100,000, okay? And the camp, interestingly, only employs Jordanians. It does not employ Syrian refugees. And again, I wonder how that decision was made. I'm thinking Palestinian camps where it was always, by and large, the day-to-day work was carried out by Palestinians. Now I'm going to mention one last thing, and that is gender issues, and not just to talk about rumors of early marriage and safety. There's always issues of safety. And this gets back to how locals conceptualize the camp and the refugees. So, camps are often considered dangerous places. Okay, you tell people you're going to a refugee camp, and they're like, really? Aren't you afraid? And, when I worked in Palestinian camps in the 70s and the early 80s, people in Lebanon would always say, even Palestinians, aren't you afraid to go there? And you say, afraid of what? Well, you could get sick. They're seen as places of disease, okay? That you might drink something, they're dirty. There's danger lurks there, okay, in whatever way. The idea of when people are unmoored from place, suddenly there's sort of this unregulated behavior, whether it's pathogens or, as I will mention, male sexuality. So a lot of this talking about Zatari and as a dangerous place is coded about male sexuality, okay? And there are rampant stories of rape and sexual assault and domestic violence. And again, we don't really know the extent of this or the extent of these before these people became refugees. But in any case, I met with one of the older tribal leaders in Zatari village, and they're all from the Bani Khalid tribe. And I said, well, what's it been like having all these Syrians here? What's the impact? And he said, well, they're so culturally different from us. Okay, 15 kilometers, and a lot of cultural ties. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, we're more religious. Okay, so he's setting up moral communities in these very small spaces. And then he said, we have a lot of trouble with Syrian boys and men. He said they come into the village and they make comments about girls, and they're looking for Jordanian girls, and this is a threat to our girls. And you go into the camps and they say the Jordanians are coming here looking for young brides or prostitutes. So you see these two communities setting up moral communities, moral boundaries about difference, okay? And it's just something to pay attention to, and it's a sexualized kind of difference, and it revolves around, in a sense, a predatory male sexuality unmoored from place, and a vulnerable female sexuality that is sort of unprotected in these new and dangerous places. So the last thing I will mention, and then I'll close, is return. And return to what? And, we need to start posing those questions. Will there be return? When? And if so, what is it going to look like? And people never go back to exactly what they came from in most refugee situations. They go to new places, they rebuild, and of course sometimes they take the ties they developed in camps with them home. It's a whole new reconfiguration of relationships based on kin and regional ties, but also new ones based on the camp. The camp sort of generates its own set of identities and ties, and we'll see how these play out with return. So I will end there so we can get into these papers. Okay, thank you.